Good afternoon. My name is Mike Weaver, and I'd like to welcome you to the Veritas Forum at Virginia Tech and Cornell University. We are pleased to have students and faculty online today from our respective universities and others from across the country. Thank you for joining us. Veritas is Latin for truth, and we want to seek truth together as we ask life's hardest questions and explore our deepest beliefs. We've come together this afternoon to consider the fascinating question: is beauty a guide to truth? Our guests today represent the intersection of physics, philosophy, and religious belief, and we look forward to an engaging conversation. Before we begin, we ask that you take out your phones, go to slido.com, and enter the event code #Cornell Veritas VT, and you can find that code in the chat as well. We will be using Slido later on to ask questions to our speakers and to collect feedback after the event. Our hope today is that this event serves as a starting point to explore and test our worldviews together. The Chesterton House at Cornell and the Bradley Study Center at Virginia Tech share with the Veritas Forum a vision that our universities grow as places where we foster a culture of honest consideration and respect with people who hold different views. As we get started, I'd like to take just a moment to say thank you to the Gianforte Foundation for their generosity in funding this forum. We are so grateful for the foundation making this important conversation possible. Thanks also to the co-hosts at Virginia Tech, Crew, InterVarsity, CCVT, and Catholic Campus Ministry. Now I'd like to take a moment to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Vivek Mathew. Vivek Mathew was born and raised in Defiance, Ohio, studied computer science at Princeton, worked in quantitative finance for nearly a decade before going to seminary at Princeton Theological Seminary. After earning a master's degree in philosophy at Oxford, he came to Cornell in 2013, where he completed his doctoral work in philosophy at the intersection of metaphysics, philosophy of religion, philosophy of language, cognitive science, and history of philosophy. He became the director of Chesterton House, a study center at Cornell University, in 2019. Now let me introduce our speakers, Dr. Ard Louis and Dr. Ben Jansen. Ard Louis is professor of theoretical physics at the University of Oxford, where he leads an interdisciplinary group of researchers. Recent interests include the physics of biological evolution and the theories of why deep learning work so well. He was born in the Netherlands, but grew up in Gabon, Central Africa. He often speaks on topics of science and religion. He made the series Why Are We Here with David Malone and appeared with Morgan Freeman in The Story of God. Benjamin Jansen is an associate professor of philosophy and associate professor of computer science by courtesy at Virginia Tech. He has worked on the physics of big biomolecules, the mystery of insect flight, naval fluid dynamics, and the philosophy of religion, the use of probability and inference, the interpretation of quantum theories, and the concept of number. Most of his research time these days is spent coaxing machines to spot the hidden similarities in diverse phenomenon and getting them to eke out new scientific theories of the deceptively mundane materials around us. Any remaining time at his disposal is spent soaking in the beauty of the forests of Southwest Virginia. Thank you, Ard and Ben, for being with us today. And Vivek, I will now pass the mic to you.
Thanks so much, Mike, and to all the folks at Bradley and others at Virginia Tech who have had the vision and initiative to put this great panel together. These forums aim at exploring big questions, and we certainly picked an ambitious one for today. Is beauty a guide to truth? It's a very difficult puzzle because there's something to be said about both answers, yes and no. On the one hand, it seems like beauty couldn't be a guide to truth just because it seems so different from truth. Beauty seems, we think of it as subjective, varying from person to person, maybe culture to culture. There are different standards of beauty. Truth feels kind of objective, out there and mind independent in ways that beauty just feels like a bad match. On the other hand, you have this situation where plenty of scientists describe themselves as being explicitly guided by considerations of aesthetics and beauty, whether they call it elegance or simplicity or parsimony. And so you have this puzzle even within the sciences, let alone the fact that perhaps scientific truth is a small portion of truth. So we couldn't ask for two better people to help us think through these puzzles than Ard and Ben, who've each spent decades thinking through aspects of these issues, and we're really glad to have them here. The plan for today is going to start with Ard, where he'll present a kind of opening, walk us through how he thinks about these issues, and then we'll turn over to Ben to also give us an extended kind of presentation and how they think. And then they're going to actually talk to each other for a little bit and let them kind of, we have no idea where that'll go. They don't know either. We'll let them kind of explore some of this territory together, and then we'll open it up to you. Now we have Slido set up for you to submit your questions. And as you're listening and you think about them, be sure to put those questions in the Slido link. And even if you don't have a question, keep an eye out on the Slido page, because there are you can influence which questions will be asked just by upvoting them. So keep that all in mind. With all that said, I think we're going to post a Slido link in the chat. Yeah, there we go. And Ard, I'll turn it over to you. So take us away. Ard, you got muted here, so why don't you just...
You got there. Thank you. I'm sorry. This is our rule of Zoom. Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you can hear me okay. This time, yes. And I just share a few slides with you just to kind of set the tone on this fascinating question. So just checking that you can see this okay. There's a very famous quote from the Romantic poet John Keats, who wrote, "Beauty is truth, truth is beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know." And this idea that beauty and truth are linked together is very old. It goes back to the ancients, and you'll find it again and again spread throughout the scientific world as well. Interestingly, Keats is also famous for another quote on this topic, where he, in another poem, Lamia, says, "Cold philosophy will conquer all mysteries, empty the haunted air and numb the mind, and unweave the rainbow, as is earth well made." And my colleague Richard Dawkins wrote a very famous book called Unweaving the Rainbow. I think Richard Dawkins is a great popularizer of science. I don't always agree with him on philosophical matters, but on this particular issue, I do agree with him, which is that the feeling of awed wonder that science can give us is one of the highest experiences of which the human psyche is capable. And very often those feelings of awed wonder, awe, the sense of the sublime, the sense of beauty, these things are linked with one another. I've got a friend at Rice University, Elaine Howard Eklund, who's one of the leading sociologists of science and religion. And she was telling me that in one of her big surveys she did of how scientists think about religion, she noticed that as she asked for these kind of big questions, scientists kept moving back to aesthetic considerations. So the idea that they love their science because of the beauty, and that they had these kind of experiences of the sublime, these experiences of awe when they discover something new. And that beauty could vary a lot, and I'll talk a little bit about how that beauty varies, but this sense of beauty was very, very common. And so she's now started a project looking at beauty in particular. What's kind of fascinating about this is that also the motivation for beauty correlates very much with the kind of seniority and how well people are doing in their field. So scientists who consider themselves to be technicians and scientists who were saying they were thinking about leaving the field were much less likely to have this experience of beauty. So whether or not their scientists are fooling themselves or not, sociologically, these kinds of considerations have played a very important role. That's what Dawkins was trying to unravel and explain in his book, Unweaving the Rainbow. So I'm going to give you one example of beauty. This is one of my great heroes, Paul Dirac, physicist at Cambridge, the other place, but can still be my hero. And in the 1920s, he was thinking about the following question. So you probably know that special relativity, Einstein's theory of high speed, was worked out in 1905. That's a theory about things that move very fast. And in the 1920s, Erwin Schrödinger came up with Schrödinger's equation, which is a theory of very small things. And so what Dirac was thinking about is what happens if you take something that's very small, you try to make it transform according to the equations of special relativity, the Lorentz transformations. And so in special relativity, you also have concepts like E is mc squared. When it moves, you get this extra p here. So you get some momentum terms. And the question was, could you get this energy equation for the Schrodinger equation to transform in the correct way according to the theories of fast things? Now, here you have two very different aspects of the world, fast things and very small things. And when you put them together, it turns out, in this case, Dirac looked at electrons, which have spin up and spin down, so they've got two components. No matter how you try to put them together, the only way that you can make it work is if you have this extra particle, this thing which we now call the positron. And very famously, Dirac published his equation, although the idea of some kind of other matter out there was insane. And he later said he published it because it was beautiful, and beauty is a guide to the truth. Now, in 1932, Carl Anderson discovered the positron at Caltech. And so this thing was discovered after it was predicted by this incredible beauty of mathematics. Now, I remember as a student first taking a course in advanced quantum mechanics and learning this derivation by Dirac and thinking, well, that can't possibly be true. How could two such distinct theories, when they combine, predict something so incredibly crazy about our natural world? And I actually spent the whole night trying to see where Dirac was wrong. And of course, that's the hubris of youth. And of course, I bowed to the great master because this is the only way of doing it. And so this kind of idea that you can use elegant mathematics to predict something about about something really unexpected about the world is a kind of something very beautiful. The Nobel Prize winner Eugene Wigner talks about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, a gift which we neither understand nor deserve. And I think it's incredibly beautiful. I think the Dirac equation is one of the most beautiful things that has ever been created. As beautiful as the most amazing painting, the most amazing piece of music, as beautiful, in fact, as the most amazing mountain range. It's absolutely, exquisitely, and incredibly beautiful. And Dirac was very strongly influenced by aesthetic considerations when he went down this direction. So this is the idea of matter and antimatter. So the idea of matter and antimatter comes from these two theories and combining them together. And it's an absolutely beautiful part of the way the world works. It's very elegant, very, very satisfying to see. Those are all aspects of, I think, that we have of when we describe something that is beautiful. I have a quote from Henri Poincaré, one of the great French mathematical physicists, who said, "A scientist does not study nature because it is useful. He studies it because he delights in it. And he delights in it because it is beautiful. If nature were not beautiful, it would not be worth knowing. And if nature were not worth knowing, life would not be worth living." I put this at the end of my lecture sometimes because I want to inspire my students that science is incredibly beautiful. And the sense of beauty, the sense of aesthetic that we have when we work on it is one of the great drivers of our discoveries. Now, beauty is complex. And so the kind of beauty you see here in quantum mechanics may not be the same as the kind of beauty you see in other parts of nature. So currently, I'm very interested in biological complexity. So let me give you an example of that. So here is a picture of the genetic regulation of an E. coli bacterium. Each of the little dots is a gene, and each arrow is a regulator that tells the other genes to turn off or turn on. One of the things that creates biological complexity is not just the number of genes you have, but also how they regulate each other or how they interact, a bit like the logic of a transistor chip. And if I write these down in a sense of equations, it looks a little bit like this, which is not particularly beautiful or elegant. Nevertheless, I believe as a physicist that there is some kind of beautiful underlying picture to this, which is much simpler and more elegant than these equations that I've written down. When Elaine Howard-Eklund and her collaborator, Brandon Vaidyanarayan, interviewed people on this, what they noticed was that the kind of beauty that inspires scientists varied a lot from field to field, from biologists who might look at beautiful things to see in nature to physicists who like elegant equations. But the idea that beauty was very much present and very inspirational for them was more or less a universal. All right, science can nonetheless be used to unweave rainbows. And I'll give you one little example, which I think which I'm going to use to explain something about how Christians might think about beauty. So let's think about the question of equality of human value. I hope that all the people in the audience would agree that humans have equal value. But how would you measure that? Is there some kind of empirical measure that you can use to get at that? So can science help you? Well, how would you measure the value of a human life? I think I can give some facetious examples, like biochemist, the value of elements in your body. So if you have gold fillings, you're worth more than somebody without gold fillings, or a physiologist, the size of your brain, psychologist, how smart you are, an anthropologist, how the community values you, an economist, how much economic value you produce. But I think we all sense instinctively that if we use these kind of scientific measures to try to calculate the value of human life, we're unweaving something incredibly important, because we sense that human beings have intrinsic value. It turns out that actually deriving the intrinsic value of human beings from a purely kind of naturalistic point of view puts you on a kind of metaphysical quicksand. And it's easy to kind of take a Nietzschean turn and then say, well, therefore this idea is invalid and perhaps even dangerous. Christians would normally make this kind of an argument based on the fact that we are all made and loved by God. It's been linked to what we call the doctrine of creation, the idea that God created a world and he created human beings and loves them, and that our value comes from that. Now that is, I think, a much more promising way of trying to extract something about the value of human beings. I'm just contrasting that to show you that science cannot often extract these kinds of things about the world, although you might be able to use science to help you sharpen some of the questions that you want to answer. And I want to use that because I want to talk about beauty in a slightly different way. I'm going to be take a daring step and talk about feminine beauty. So here I've got a picture of some models on a catwalk. And one of the fascinating things about this is that each of these people looks remarkably similar to each other. There's a very narrow aesthetic value. And even when you diversify it in quotes and you add people of color, for example, you'll notice that they actually look the same as everybody else, except they're just slightly tweaked. Now compare that to the kinds of people you have in the audience, or for example, someone like myself who grew up in Africa and then traveled around Asia, now live in the UK. The way that people look varies dramatically. The kind of local aesthetics that people have for what they consider to be beautiful can vary dramatically. So why is it that we have such an incredibly narrow view of beauty in the fashion industry? And I would say it's because our ideas of beauty are twisted. And I want to end with this quote from C.S. Lewis, a great Oxford writer, who has a lovely book called The Screwtape Letters, where these two devils are writing to each other about how they want to tempt somebody. And Screwtape writes to Wormwood, God is a hedonist at heart. He makes no secret of it. At his right hand are pleasures forevermore. His world is full of pleasures. There are things for humans to do all day long without his minding in the least: sleeping, washing, eating, drinking, making love, playing, praying, working. Everything has to be twisted before it's of any use to us. We fight under cruel disadvantages. Nothing is naturally on our side. And so Christians would say that beauty, one of the dangers of beauty is that it's so easily twisted. And the example I just gave you of feminine beauty ideals in the Western kind of fashion industry, where they all look very similar to a particular type of Northern European woman. There's something deeply and fundamentally twisted about that beauty image. So one of the things I think about beauty and truth is that beauty can be deceptive. Beauty, I think, in order to truly understand the link between beauty and truth, we also have to understand something about the wide diversity of beauties that are there. And I think this links very closely, for Christians at least, to the idea of a doctrine of creation for a world that was made with incredible diversity. And therefore we should expect beauty to have an incredible diversity as well. With that, I want to thank you for your time and hand over to Ben.
Thanks, Art. Ben, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much for including me in this conversation. Let me offer a sort of a different framing of our question. So when I was a much younger man, I prospected for dinosaurs in the Badlands of southern Alberta. I clearly remember walking the rim of a deep canyon with two team members when we happened upon a rock. This rock was smooth and had been dropped by a glacier. It was about the size and shape of the wheel of a small car. None of us had to speak to the others. We immediately stopped walking, and two of us crouched down and hoisted that rock up onto its edge. It was about 200, 300 pounds. And we flipped it, thump. And it kept flipping down the side of the hill, thump, 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 gaining speed. Eventually, it finds its natural axis of rotation, and now it is spinning like a wheel. And that rock leapt, it dove, it skittered, it gouged like a living thing. It's running down this topography we can't see from the top of the canyon. And like a living thing, at the bottom of the canyon, it darts into a scrubby patch of bushes and trees with a crash. And for a moment, there's a pause. We all thought the show was over. We had just started to turn when that rock came out the other side of the grove and started climbing up the other side of the canyon. When finally it collides with the block of sandstone and annihilates it in a cloud of dust. That event, a rock rolling down a hill, was one of the most beautiful things I, and I think my companions, had ever seen. At the very least, it has clearly stuck with me for all of these years. As a young student of physics, I had a similarly formative experience of beauty involving wheels. I recall the first time I grasped how the simple and austere principle of conservation of energy dictates the speed at which an idealized wheel rolling down an idealized canyon must be going when it reaches the bottom. In the case of my wheel, by the way, it was about 80 miles per hour, in case you're curious. That gave me a similar thrill of having glimpsed the beautiful. Now, I share these two recollections to illustrate at least two faces of beauty. Art has already pointed out that beauty is complex, and I want to point to two very different aspects. One, I'm going to call the beauty of experience, or beauty in the experience. This is beauty that emanates directly from our participation in the world, like watching that rock careen down the canyon. The other is beauty in the apprehension. This is beauty in the apprehending or grasping a representation or story about the world. This is the sense of understanding, the aha moment of getting how conservation of energy gives me that speed. These two aspects or sources of beauty take on radically different significance depending on which of two views of the world you happen to hold. One of these views I'm going to call Platonic. In this view, all the phenomena of our day-to-day existence, what we experience at the scale of medium-sized dry goods, emanates from a few principles, perfect and regular in their operation. What we might call laws of nature, say. Everything we experience in the moment is some shadow of these principles imperfectly presented to us. Right? This includes the beauty of the experience. From this Platonic view, the greatest possible experience of beauty is apprehending those original principles. In the world of fine arts, Michelangelo, an avowed Neoplatonist, is a good representative of this attitude. Think of what he says of the statue of David being revealed in the stone, not crafted. Right? That statue, the figure that we get, is a reflection of, and is meant to be a reflection of, some ideal form that can't be realized in the experience. The beauty lies in the ideal human form that statue reflects. The other view of the world we might call Aristotelian, in honor of Plato's contrarian student. In this view, the nitty-gritty phenomena we access in our experience, the phenomena that display infinite detail of pattern and variation, are the substrate of the world. And any principle we use to summarize or describe those phenomena are themselves but poor shadows of the happenings, of the experiences. The beauty of experience is a gift of the world in this view, while the beauty of apprehension is a byproduct of the stories we tell. We seek to organize or to find pattern, right, to help us conceptualize this beauty of experience. Artistically, I think Via Selmans represents this attitude well. She's a Latvian-American artist famous for her drawings of desert pebbles and ocean surfaces. Drawings that replicate in extraordinary richness all the details we tend to abstract away when we imagine such a thing, we remember such a thing, rather than stand in its presence. So what does beauty then have to do with truth? Again, it depends on which of these views of the world you adopt. For the Aristotelian, the central question is, what is true of this beauty? The beauty of experience provokes us to try and organize it into tractable patterns, but there's no necessary connection between the beauty and apprehension of any of these patterns we might nominate and they're actually being true of those things in the world. For the Platonist, the central question is which beauty is true. If we assume that there are these laws or principles that determine the phenomena, and furthermore, that these laws are comprehensible, are apprehendable by beings like us, then there is a close connection between truth and the beauty of apprehension, the beauty of that aha moment. That which we find beautiful to apprehend is a good candidate for the true principle that generates the world. Now, what do I think about this connection? As you might have guessed by this point, I'm an Aristotelian. And from that view, recall that the beauty of apprehension is about our descriptions of the world, stories we tell. There are many beautiful lies, and I am suspicious of beauty as a guide to any sort of truth. But even if the Platonist is right about those underlying principles, I still don't see any reason to take that extra premise. I don't see any reason why those principles, those laws, should be comprehensible to us. And I suppose I would point out that as Art already mentioned, there's variation from discipline to discipline with respect to scientists' sense of beauty. But I would suggest that the sense of beauty scientists individually cultivate is even more idiosyncratic than that. And that what it is likely indicative of is the history of recent scientific successes. That which we created, that which gave us a moment of beauty of apprehension sticks with us. Right? That's what we seek in the future. It's not a guide, right? As much as it's a summary of the history of our success, it's not a guide to the creation of future success. And I think now we get to it.
Thanks.
Yeah. Try these ideas.
So we got both of these kind of views laid out on the table. Art, do you want to kick us off, and I'll let you two have the floor for a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So I'm just trying to think of the Dirac experience and asking myself whether this is Aristotelian or Platonic. And I think Dirac was a bit of a Platonist, but I don't think that's what he is getting at or what subsequent physicists are getting at. I think what they're getting at is if you have a number of different, what you often have is you've got a phenomenon you're trying to explain, you've got multiple explanations that seem consistent. And so what this strand of physics has shown is very often picking something that is relatively simple or elegant or has a certain kind of beauty to it has turned out to be correct. Whereas there might have been other more complex descriptions that haven't always been correct. Now, this is not the case that this always works, but it works often enough that people are very struck by it. And so I think in theoretical physics, for example, this idea that beauty and elegance, something that's often hard to explain, but people recognize it. And so one of the points is I can write on something, say this is a beautiful derivation or beautiful equation. People will by and large say, yes, they recognize it, even if it's not so easy to put into words what we exactly see. And I don't think that, I don't think that we need to make this distinction quite between having to believe that there is some kind of deeper beauty out there that we're going towards, or that there's a beauty in the apprehension. I think these things are linked.
So if you finished your thought, there's lots of things I'd like to say to that, but I'll try to stick with two and see if this takes us down an interesting path. So the small thing has to do with the Dirac example itself. Yeah. It's not obvious to me that's the best choice of beauty guiding us, in the sense that in that particular example, and we can let this go by the wayside, but it looks to me as though what Dirac is doing is an example of constrained search. It's not that he had a sort of palette of possibilities and selected from amongst them the most beautiful. Rather, he had two, let's say, empirically well-motivated constraints. You have a sort of a symmetry constraint and a conservation constraint, and that imposed on him this supposition of the positron. But we could, of course, put on the table other examples where I don't know, Gelman's omega minus, where the claim at least was that the way at which it was arrived at, and again, I'm a little skeptical of this, was by selecting from amongst the options in most beauty. So let me ask you, with respect to sort of a shared sense of beauty in the community as a guide, I take it, so if we don't want to commit to this sort of Platonic supposition that the world will be such we can apprehend it, and that the principles are really sort of simple out there, we just need to identify them by their hallmark of beauty. If we don't want to take those suppositions, then one way this sort of link is often defended is something like a meta induction. This we've come in our arduous journey to being professional scientists. We've seen what works, and that gives us a sense of beauty. Now this happens all the time, right? Like I've soldered thousands of solder joints. I actually have an opinion as to what constitutes a beautiful solder joint. I didn't before, I do now, and it has a lot to do with one that will work. And I take it the idea is something like this is true of science.
Yeah, no, I think it goes beyond that. So I think there may well be something beautiful in solder joints that work well. And then what you find beautiful is the fact that it works well. But probably the fact that it works well is also linked to some aesthetic considerations of what the joint looks like. It's not irregular, et cetera, and that's interesting in of itself that that's true. I think in the case of the science, it's not just that we are somehow enculturated into this and therefore now we believe this is beautiful. We worked hard, now we think it's beautiful. I think you can't have an experience like watching special relativity and quantum mechanics combined to make antimatter without thinking there's something deeply beautiful about it. I think Dirac's point about the beauty was not that he had a constrained search, that's what he ended up with. It was that he ended up with something so crazy it seemed absurd. And then he just said, look, it's such a beautiful, elegant equation, it must be true. And therefore he published it anyway. And that's the sense of beauty that there was, right? So the sense of beauty was, this is so beautiful, it must be true. And therefore he published it. And then it seemed fantastical or just bizarre, and maybe some kind of mathematical weirdness and possibly wrong, but it ended up being true about the world. And that's the sense of beauty that there is. So he was using beauty as between multiple ways of trying to make this work, a way that that actually added an extra kind of ansatz about the world that seems ridiculous, because he felt that was the more aesthetically beautiful one to do. Now, of course, that experience has sociologically infected the community for good or for ill, and so that we'd all like to do something like Dirac again. And there have been steps that where things of similar nature have happened. And in our film Why Are We Here that I made with David Malone, we did a long interview with Frank Wilczek, a very Nobel Prize-winning physicist who has written a very beautiful book, a very nice book on beauty. And he talks about discovering the strong force. And if you look on I think somewhere they've linked the our interviews that we made. But he talks about this discovery, and which he made amazingly when he was, I think, 22 or 23 years old, which is a pretty amazing age to discover how one of the four forces of nature works. But he said, there are lots of different ways of thinking about it, and we beauty was a very important guide into the one that we chose, and the one that actually ended up working, the one that gave something called asymptotic freedom. And so the experience of, and Wilczek has done this many times again in his work. And so the genius of like Wilczek, of course, is that he knows when to use this and when not to, when to start and when to stop. That's why he's a Nobel Prize winner and others of us are not. But it's fascinating to see how that continues on. That's the Diracian tradition. And of course, we're influenced by that, right? So our hero is Wilczek and Gell-Mann and Dirac. We'd like to do that again. So now I've moved into looking at biological systems. These are much more complex and they're much less amenable to this kind of approach. And biologists, in fact, are often very suspicious of this kind of approach. They're suspicious much more generally of kind of inductive reasoning of this type. And I think for good reason. But I nevertheless think as a physicist that there are aspects of the biological world that are going to be a lot simpler, a lot more Diracian once we understand them properly. And so I think there's good kind of pragmatic reasons to be suspicious of inductive arguments. That's because these inductive arguments have to be constrained by data, and I think data often isn't good enough. So, for example, I work on evolutionary theory, which is often presented in ways that I think are aesthetically not very attractive. I think it's one of the reasons for a lot of lay opposition to evolutionary theory. And one of my kind of goals in life is to try to make it a more beautiful theory, a more aesthetically pleasing theory, which I think it can be if you understand it properly. And I think in so doing, it'll also make it more palatable for many people who find it difficult.
So,
Okay, I'm going to jump in here because we're actually at time to start letting our audience ask some questions, and we have some already on the table. So I'll just throw this out to both of you because I think it applies to both of you. A question from an anonymous viewer asking, I think your views on, do you think beauty is intrinsically a trait, or is it something that only exists from a secondary point of view? Or is it something that exists because we label or create something as beautiful? Each of you hinted at aspects of your answer. It'd be nice to just flesh those out a little bit.
I'll let Ben answer that since he's a philosopher.
Sure. So in my view, it's a little bit of both. I suspect, or I think that there are aspects of beauty, particularly, well, actually both of the sorts I described, beauty in the experience and beauty in apprehension, that are inescapable and almost certainly consequences of being the kind of thing that can respond adaptively to a world. So you make a thing with a mind that gives it, or at least the minimal sort of mind that gives it the ability to respond to an environment. And for a variety of reasons, I think that such a thing must have something along the lines of the experience of beauty, just like it has something like pain and positive affect or pleasure. But beauty is also highly malleable, and in that sense can be constructed. I mean, Ard pointed to the folks on the catwalk and to cultural variations in ideals of beauty. But there's also, as I was trying to suggest with the mention of soldering, there's a sort of sense of beauty that comes with habituation and familiarity. I mean, there's a very robust psychological effect. The more you're exposed to a thing, the insofar as you're not harmed, the greater your sense of affection, regardless of any other effects of the thing. And the sense that derives from our repeated toil in a particular area is usually a very compelling emotion or experience of beauty. So I think it's a little of both. Ard?
I think that's a good answer. I think that it's a bit of both. I think there is sometimes a tendency to say, because there are cultural variations in how we see certain beautiful things, therefore it's nothing but that. I don't think that's necessarily true. Although, it's defining beauty perfectly is a famous philosophical black hole. And many philosophers have fallen down, never to come back up again. On the other hand, it's a little bit like there's a very famous judge. I forget the name of the judge. You might remember this, Ben. But he was asked how he could distinguish, art from pornography, and he said, I can't give you a definition, but I know it when I see it. And I think this with beauty is the same thing. We do know it when we see it very often, even if we can't necessarily always give it a complete fixed definition. And that's why I wanted to emphasize that beauty is a complex thing. But one of the things that you see in the experience of scientists of beauty is also, you get the sense of awe or a sense of the sublime. One of the things we noticed when we made our film, we interviewed a lot of scientists and asked them questions about beauty, asked them how did they feel when they made discoveries. And this is where we started talking about the sublime, which often even brings a kind of sense of terror, a sense of fear, like you've touched something that you really know, something very beautiful, the kind of thing you see when you walk around a corner up a cliff, and suddenly you see this incredible mountain vista. You sense a sense of something larger than yourself. I think beauty does that to us. It centers us. It makes us feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And I don't think that is just a kind of a psychological adaptation. I think that is a kind of something about our world. As a theist, obviously, as a Christian, I believe that's something that God has put into the world as signs of transcendence that tell us something about the way the world is. I mean, the world could very well not have this. The world could not have elegance. The world could not have intelligibility. Those are all surprising things about the world. And on theism, I think they're more likely. And so I look at that. That's my own, my own kind of lens that I look at the world with, and I think that is an important part of how I think about that. And I think, well, beauty is part of that, even if I recognize it as heavily culturally and historically colored.
We have a couple of questions that I think are for Ard. Do physicists all really agree that Dirac's equation is really beautiful? Is there any disagreement about it? They have different taste about it? And a follow-up, I'll combine this with another one. If so, even if they did agree, could this be just because you're trained in graduate school, you're socialized in a certain way? I'm pretty sure most of us lay people, when we saw your slide with Dirac's equation, we didn't think, wow, that's beautiful. We were like, what does that mean? We squinted our eyes. And so we have to be trained, like you'd have to like habituate us, as Ben said, into this sort of thing. And these questions might be pushing at, maybe there's this other explanation for beauty beyond God made the world with beautiful.
We do physicists disagree. I think physicists will disagree on everything, but it's a pretty vast majority view. And no, I think just obviously we are socialized into thinking about certain things, but in certain ways. But I think that many physicists' experience of the Dirac equation is one of surprise, of awe, and of beauty in a way that's is not just because we were trained to think about it that way. So even if nobody told me it is beautiful, I might go back and say it is beautiful. And that's a very common experience. And so that experience is a very commonly shared one. Even in fact, I'd say one of the problems with physics education is that it doesn't emphasize nearly enough the sense of beauty, the sense of awe. It's often ignored in education. It becomes a kind of rote, doing lots of problem sets. But that beauty is something that you see on the side. In fact, often it's linked to understanding. So just like you may, if you're not trained in music, you may not appreciate something about a very subtle piece of music. You may not appreciate Bach's fugues, for example, if all you've listened to your whole life is a country music, as an example. Nothing wrong with country music, but you're not going to appreciate the fugues in the same way. But if you're trained classically, you will. And that's just normal. That's the way our world is, right? There are certain types of beauty that you need some training in order to understand what is beautiful about them.
Can I make a quick comment there? Two things about the agreement in the sense of beauty. We certainly don't have time to try to do some kind of proper sampling, but there are cases like, for example, the vortex theory of atomic structure, where the community at large hailed this as so beautiful it must be true, and nobody remembers it anymore. So one wonders a little bit about some confirmation bias in what sets the sense of beauty. But I guess I also want to point briefly to pretty large divisions in science. There's a pretty nice article recently in Nature, a perspective by Ben MacArthur, on the differences in the sense of beauty between the physical and the biological sciences. And they line up kind of interestingly with the Platonic and Aristotelian perspectives that I had sketched. So maybe it's not quite so uniform across the sciences, and maybe not quite so, maybe unanimity isn't such a guide to truth within a given discipline.
So we have a question coming in about whether beauty is objective or subjective, which is a classic kind of part of the discussion literature on beauty and philosophy. If it's just subjective, the question goes on, is it then a different category kind of beauty? I'm guessing they're talking about this sort of mathematical, or the sort of beauty that guides fundamental physics. And it sounds like, just to clarify for the audience, it sounds like in the background, Ard, are you thinking of beauty as like, look, it varies quite a bit, and yet there's this core unity which cries out for explanation? And then Ben, are you thinking like, no, even if there's unity, we have other explanations for it, and we need not appeal to anything like a transcendent kind of objective beauty? That help us as lay people understand where you're each coming from. So Ard, why don't you start out, since we just heard from Ben?
I think you summarized it well, so I'll hand over to Ben.
Okay, yeah, I would want to draw a distinction. So I think Ard and I actually disagree to a large extent. I think there is an objective phenomenon of beauty in the sense that it is an essential part of one's experience of the world. It's like color, it's like pain. There's no avoiding it. But what I am critical of is not, what I'm not saying is that the sense of beauty is somehow subjective or purely constructed. What I'm concerned about is the connection between that experience and this other thing, which is rather abstract, which is these claims that we make about the nature of the world based on some sense of beauty we get from apprehending that story, that explanation. So I'm critical of the connection between what I take to be a real phenomenon of beauty and this other thing, this understanding of how the world is.
I think where we also agree is that we both agree that science can be extraordinarily beautiful. And we both give examples of that. And I think we don't think necessarily that those conceptions of beauty are purely subjective, in the sense that I think that anybody else, so one of the interesting things about the beauty in physics, one of the things that's in the sociological study, is that these ideas of what was beautiful were widely shared across different cultures, which might have many other aspects of beauty, like say human beauty, that might vary quite a lot. And so the idea would be this is quite similar. There's an interesting study by one of the people we introduced in the film as well, Samir Zeki, who's a neuroscientist in London, who, together with Sir Michael Atiyah, a famous mathematician, did a study with a brain scanner of having mathematicians look at equations and rank them in beauty. And there's a part of your brain that lights up when you see something beautiful. And so what they notice is these mathematicians from a wide range of different cultural backgrounds, all more or less agreed on which equations were most beautiful. And so the point is simply that there's a correlate between the same. So if you put those same people in front of a beautiful painting or a beautiful landscape, the same bit of their brain would light up. So the point was the bit of their brain that was lighting up when they saw these mathematical equations was the same as their experience of beauty in other contexts. And so whatever this neurocorrelate is, it correlates with the experience of beauty. And what is fascinating is how much this is shared across cultures. It's more complex because one of the points is that some of the equations people like just because they look beautiful. So very famously, Euler's equation, e to the pi is -1, it's beautiful. It's also pretty to look at, right? There are other equations, like I wrote a Dirac's equation in one way. You can write it in many different ways. Some ways are more beautiful than others. In fact, when we interviewed Sir Roger Penrose here in Oxford, who just won the Nobel Prize actually last year, we interviewed him, and he's very much a Platonist and a big believer in beauty. I was talking to him about the Dirac equation. I started putting it on the board, and he insisted I wanted to do it in a slightly different way, which is more beautiful, using spinners. And that's just an aesthetic point. You can actually write the equation down in many different ways, but when people talk about the beauty, they're not talking about how you write it. They're talking about what it actually means.
Yeah, and actually that sort of gets to what I was saying. So that neurobiological study you're speaking of, many of the participants in that study didn't know what the equations meant. They had no way to interpret. So to them, it's this experience of a visual object. And there we're talking about this sort of what I was calling this beauty of experience. And we know that people like things that are somewhere on the edge of chaos, right? Enough order, but enough disorder to spark our sense of beauty there. But the question is, does that have anything to do with what the things actually represent are true? What they say about the world are so. And I guess I would say broadly that, look, I think sometimes in the short run, certain of those rules do line up with what's necessarily an inductively apt procedure, but just as often they don't.
And maybe it's a good time to segue into, we talked about this, the three of us, a little bit before, where if we raise the scope of truth to be beyond just empirical sciences, beyond natural sciences, and there were some surprising points of agreement between you and some further disagreement. Why don't you each kind of go say how you just sketch out how you think of that? So Art, do you want to begin?
Ben, I don't quite understand your question.
Oh, sorry. I mean, you mentioned some stuff about human value. How do you value humans? And these are questions beyond merely empirical natural sciences. So this is a question: can beauty be a guide to empirical truth? And then there can beauty be a guide to truth simpliciter. So like, there's more to truth than just what the empirical sciences say, which is you kind of suggested.
Well, I mean, this is a much longer conversation. And I think I'm also a little bit more hesitant to tread in that direction since I am a scientist and not a philosopher or a sociologist. But I do think that beauty, I think so. Beauty is a very important part of our world. I think it has a lot to do with human flourishing. So I think, for example, I think beautiful architecture is important, not just because we think it's pretty to look at, because I think it leads to human flourishing in certain ways if it's done well. I mean, Elaine Scarriott, who's a professor of English at Harvard, has a really interesting set of ideas, a book actually, about beauty and justice, where she links the two. And this is because beauty, I think what beauty does to us is it creates a sense of transcendence, it creates a sense of centering to us, it also creates a sense of motivation. And so I think those are kinds of directions I might go, very briefly on this question. So I think, yes, there are links to truth there, but I think, interestingly, I think they are harder, there are things harder to pin down than I think the senses of beauty in the sciences, which are pretty strongly felt.
Okay, and Ben, so yeah, you've been pushing against the idea that beauty can be a reliable guide in the natural sciences. How does your answer change if we were to just expand to truth in general?
Well, that's an awfully large bucket of things to think about. But so I would say from a sort of Platonic perspective, I might not be so worried about it. It's not really a different question in kind if what I'm trying to do is sort of, ascertain the right simple principle, because I'll know it when I see it, because I will think that beauty and apprehension is telling me about this truth. But from my perspective, from this sort of Aristotelian perspective, it's even worse once we leave the empirical sciences. In the empirical sciences, you can cultivate a sense of beauty that is a sort of meta induction on theory construction, on ways to attempt to grasp a certain sort of pattern. And
just to unpack that for the audience, so a meta induction, like an induction on an induction, you want to just say in simple terms, what do you mean by this?
Yeah, so you've built laws that do pretty well with a wide range of stuff over and over again. And every time you get some new phenomena, you build a new law and you start to recognize patterns in this. Just like if you're doing something like soldering, you do it over and over again, you start to recognize patterns in what makes it good. And you come to see those as beautiful. And so the thought is that in a scientific context, this is one of the arguments for connection between truth and beauty in science, is that, look, we get to do this over and over again. And we see that, hey, when we appeal to symmetry, that gets us a theory that does the job. And so more and more we see symmetry as beautiful, as just, when we apprehend a theory with symmetry, we see it as beautiful. But when you step outside of that context, where you don't have this feedback from the world over and over again, then I worry there's, from an Aristotelian perspective, there's nothing to guide your tuning of your sense of beauty in this case. There's, that sense is malleable, particularly when we're talking about apprehension. And if I don't already know the truth, it's pretty hard for me to develop the sense that connects the two.
All right, thanks. And we have a follow-up question kind of from someone asking about Sabine Hossenfelder, I believe. Some people claim that beauty is currently leading physics astray, and it mentions Hossenfelder in parentheses. What do you think about this? And this might be grist for your mill, Ben, but Ard, why don't you start?
Yeah, no, so I'm quite familiar with that literature. I think she has so the point that she's getting at a little bit is to say, this using beauty as a guide has been very successful up to now. At the moment, what she's really saying is, I think, is the following. We've tried for a long time to combine quantum mechanics, so really the standard model, the theory of the strong force and the weak force, with gravity, and the electro weak force, electromagnetism with gravity, and we've not succeeded. Gravity, we have this general theory of relativity. It's completely different from these quantized pictures of the world. And a lot of what's happened is people have used mathematical ideas and used beauty as a guide. So string theory is a classic example. My colleagues who work on string theory will say, it's so beautiful, it has to be true. It's a very, very common That has guided the field for the last 30 years. And her argument is, well, perhaps we should take a step back and not use this kind of Diracian way and try something different because it hasn't worked. And I think that's fair, right? I think that's a fair argument. She's not saying that beauty hasn't worked extremely well. She pointed that it hasn't very well. She's just saying, given the failure we have had so far, perhaps we should jettison that. There's another aspect to her argument, which people like George Ellis have pushed on, which is that when you're theorizing without experimental constraint, you keep doing this for a long time, at some point you're moving into something that's more like philosophy than traditional science. If that is the case, then you might want to think about this as a kind of philosophy of cosmology rather than just science per se. And therefore you might want to adjust some of the way that you do you make your claims or how you might do your arguments. And I think that's just because there's some in the news today, I saw that people in Fermilab think they might have found a fifth force, but we're still very far from seeing anything that would help us constrain these theories. And so that case, as Ellis and others, we ought to be more careful about the kind of claims that we make.
And if I understand you right, Art, never did you say something like, it's so beautiful, it has to be true. Like beauty is this like subjective experience of beauty are necessarily a guide. It sounds like you're saying they often are, and it's haunting and mysterious and a deep puzzle why. Is that fair?
That's a nice way of summarizing it. Yes, they often are. And physicists will say that, and this has played an incredibly important role in physics, in modern physics. And so what is being critiqued here is the idea that we've done this for a long time, and perhaps we should allow a few other voices at the table. And I think, I'm all for diversity in scientific approaches, and I think that would be a good thing to do. But I mean, the point is that this idea of beauty, it's so beautiful must be true, is such a strongly felt in physics that this has pushed a field on for a very long time. And then these ideas are extremely beautiful. And
right. You can't avoid.
Beauty isn't like the equations look beautiful. Beauty is there's something incredibly elegant about how some of these things work together. There's correspondences between the theories and different limits that somehow link together in ways that seem so beautiful that they must tell us something about the way the world is.
And just to clarify, Ben, so we don't have the wrong impression, it doesn't sound like you're saying scientists should revise their practice of science by appealing to beauty here and there when they, like, in the side try to justify a choice of a hypothesis. Am I right in saying that? Like, you're okay with that? You're just reflecting on what's going on behind that. Is that right?
I suppose I'd say I'd prefer in terms of methodology if people were significantly more direct. So there is, in the sense that there are some clear and hard-headed ways to look at the development of inductive development of a theory, of going from your observation to the next construct. This is, where I would point people is to what's called formal learning theory. Now, is that, there are two things at play here. One is sort of the logic of the problem. If this is what we want to explain, what would get us there? What would reliably get us there insofar as anything does? What's the strongest guarantee we can have? How do we go there? And I am saying that I don't think the sense of beauty is that. I think that I think what Dr. Hassenfelder's book shows about the current state of physics is maybe that it really is a sort of, this attachment to or use of beauty is an appeal to recent past successes and is not itself a productive method for guaranteeing us forward progress. But what, as a psychological fact, human beings are able to do, right? So a lot turns on what we expect our theories to be. If our theory is to be something that can be apprehended by one person, then we are severely sort of limited in which of this pieces of this logical space we can explore. So when you ask me if I'm trying to tell scientists to change their practice, the answer is it depends on what you're willing to understand a theory of physics to be. If it is to be the traditional sort of thing where we can write down a simple analytic expression, something in a mathematical form that's closed and say, this is how the world works. If that's the constraint, then we probably are permanently hobbled by our various limitations, in which case, various appeals to beauty are okay, but let's not mistake them for guarantees. If we take a broader view of what a theory can be, which actually sort of allows into the discussion things that are beyond an individual apprehension, then it's a totally different question. Then it's a question of sort of what we can achieve collectively or piecemeal, and that's a much longer conversation.
All right. Well, thank you both. I want to throw over to Mike here. I just think we can all thank both our speakers. You've been fantastic guides through some pretty deep waters. We'd love to have you both back again. So Mike, I'll give it over to you to close us out.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Vivek. I hope you all enjoyed today's discussion. The forum planning team hopes that every Veritas forum that we host is relevant, respectful, engaging, and thought-provoking, and we need your help with that. So please take a moment to complete your Slido survey. We'll only use your email for one of two options: if you indicate that you want to be entered into the $50 Amazon gift card, or if you indicate that you would love to help plan a future forum. And we'll be doing a forum next year at Virginia Tech if you're interested in that and happen to be here. So before you leave, we just have an announcement. We want to thank our co-sponsors at Virginia Tech, Cru, CCVT, InterVarsity, and Catholic Campus Ministries. And also today's forum is graciously made possible by the GN4T Foundation, and we're grateful for their support. Finally, please join me once again in thanking Vivek, Ard, and Ben for their time, insights, and wisdom. Thank you for joining us today.
So Ben, I've got a quick question.
Sure.
When you say formal learning theory, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, I just wanted to get that in, but I wanted to get that in because
what kind of formal learning theory are you talking about?
I'm sorry. I mean, so it goes by various names. So logical reliability, formal learning theory, or what's the other one that you often see in the computational context?
Learning, no.
What's that?
Not PAC.
Not PAC, actually. So PAC, you can view PAC learning as falling under the sort of formal learning broadly construed, but formal learning is this umbrella term for a means-ends approach to epistemology in philosophy, but it emerged simultaneously in linguistics in the work of Gold, and then got picked up by the computer science community under Osserhoff and oh gosh, I'm forgetting the other name. But at the same time, in the 60s, it was invented by Hilary Putnam, the philosopher of science, and it went in the direction of sort of logical reliability. And now these two communities spend a fair amount of time, well, in working independently. You know how this goes, but the rough idea is, so in the original linguistic case, it was the problem of what grammars are learnable. So you had Chomsky's idea of this universal grammar, and then the details of which particular grammar you acquire are attained by hearing, getting samples, some finite stream of samples from competent speakers of the language, and that's going to fix your grammar. And so the inductive problem here that Gold considered was what class of grammars is such that you will converge on correctly using the grammar. So you'll converge on the right answer given an indefinite stream of observations of speakers. Yeah. And this is sort of the general schema. So, you have some hypothesis space. So there's got to be, this is why it's means ends. You have to be clear about what you're willing to assume. So if you're talking about like the set of all computable hypotheses, forget about it. You can't learn anything. You tell me what the constraints are on the hypothesis space. You tell me what the constraints are on my learner, who's going to do one of any number of things like choose a hypothesis or predict the next event. And then we consider the class of all possible worlds that we're willing to entertain. And then we look for the strongest guarantee you can have of success at that problem.
Okay, so I've been working recently on learning theory in the context of machine learning.
Yeah, in the statistical learning framework. So we're talking about Vapnik and Chervonenkis and as united with the sort of PAC framework.
No, I've done a whole bunch of work on that recently, and it's been kind of fascinating. One of the interesting things about it is that because you're always looking for bounds, right? So you're always looking for, what you're actually often looking at in this language is, can you guarantee the worst possible prediction? Right? So can you guarantee, can you put a bound on your error? So your
Yeah.
error never be larger than X, Y. And I think it's problematic. And so what we show is that in neural networks, all those theories don't work. So VC dimension or kind of basic packet learning give nonsensical bounds. And that's because in these machine learning situations, you have very many different hypotheses that all fit the data. So what you need is some kind of inductive bias that allows you to choose between different hypotheses. And I think what happens is something like this in practice, although in theory, you could get it horribly wrong. You can also construct examples where it goes horribly wrong. In practice, I think very often you can do quite well without needing to worry about these kinds of bounds. And
Yeah, I mean, let's take the neural network case, because there's two options, right? So if we're talking about like a pure feed forward network, I know it gets super hard to even figure what the VC dimension is if we start adding in, convolution layers and pooling and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, huge.
Sorry, go ahead.
VC dimension gets unbelievably huge really quickly.
Right. Because these things are so, you have insufficient bias in the hypothesis pool to get you a reasonable VC dimension. That's fair. So then you have huge bounds on data, but what you're saying is, but it seems like it works pretty well anyway, despite those ugly bounds. Is that?
What I'm saying is work real. So what I'm saying is the kinds of typical bounds, the kind of bounds that classical learning theory cares about, which are worst case bounds, fundamentally fail for this kind of inference because these systems aren't. It's true these systems can do as badly as the worst case bounds say, but that's not what they do in practice.
Yeah. Now, I mean, it's part of it. I'm sorry.
When you take a neural network, you're not trying to make it learn anything. You're trying to make it learn something very specific, which is something usually kind of structured problem, and problems that have a certain kind of simplicity.
Yeah, right. So look, you're in this kind of learning problem, you're attempting to learn a static probability distribution, or what you're assuming is a static probability distribution, and you're learning a joint distribution. And generally speaking, like you said, the distributions that we care about learning are highly structured. So there's some. We often know something about that structure, such that you can narrow down the space of possibilities. But I guess I was going to ask, and I don't know the answer to this because it hadn't occurred to me before. So there's a bunch of work on I forget what term they use, but for any deep network, you can identify a very tiny subset of the network that does just as well as the whole. So this is kind of in the same literature with the reservoir computing approaches, where, roughly speaking, if I pick a neural net at random and I don't train it, I can identify a subnetwork of the deep network that will solve my problem as well as the fully trained overall network. And so I guess what I'm wondering is that really telling us that we're not making use of the full hypothesis space that has this tremendous VC dimension?
Yeah, I think that is. So it's basically an expressivity question, right? So these neural networks are hugely expressive. And so you don't need the full neural network to still be expressive enough to find the solution that you want.
Right.
Another set of ideas about that, something called the lottery ticket hypothesis, which is somewhat similar. And so I think all I'm saying is, I've written now a series of papers on this where I'm basically claiming that neural networks themselves are biased towards simple solutions, so that although they've got many possible hypotheses they could fit into the data, they are much more likely to pick ones that have low descriptional complexity, overall complexity. And that explains why they generalize so well. So why they work so well is because of this. And then the reason I was asking you is because so this is a long conversation. I've now got some fairly set ideas on how this works for neural networks, particularly. I was actually interested in what this means for scientific induction, because you were saying, well, scientists should think about using formal learning theory.
Yeah.
Well, my experience of formal learning theory, at least the kind of VC dimension type of approaches, these are worst case scenarios. And I think what we see with neural networks is that's actually not the right way to approach them. You've got to take into account something about the structure of the stuff that you're looking at.
Yeah. So, okay.
Pick a learner. In other words, why does the neural network generalize well? Well, it's because it's got an inductive bias, so it's a high probability of picking a function that is a good description of your data. That's a tautology in some sense, right? That's what it does. And what's interesting is traditionally what you would say is, well, you don't want to over parameterize because then you're going to overfit. You're not going to pick you're going to pick up on stuff that's not important. But the networks over parameterize and they still do really well. It's because they're biased towards simple solutions, even though they could do any solution. So they're virtually any solution because they're highly expressive. And I was just wondering whether when people use this kind of formal learning theory more abstractly, whether they're not falling into the same kind of trap.
Well, so I guess I'm not quite sure I see the trap yet, in the sense that, I mean, deep networks have, so I guess the setup is something like this. Like, look, here's the problem I want to solve. I want to get as close as I can out of this set of possibilities to the right joint distribution. I mean, we're classifying pictures or whatever, but it's ultimately a joint distribution. And so what pack learning is telling me, or better yet, what I get for guarantees from the VC dimension is telling me is, how, if it's a finite VC dimension, then at least I get bounds on, I get a guarantee that I'll get close to the optimal, not necessarily the Bayes solution, because that might not be in the set of hypotheses, but I'll get close to the optimal one with arbitrarily high probability. You tell me the probability and I'll know the bounds on the data I need. And insofar as the neural nets, so I guess where my confusion is coming is that if the nets are really in their implementation biased toward simpler answers, so what I'm thinking of here is that you're doing something implicitly like structural risk minimization, Vapnik's proposal, then the effective VC dimension of the thing, either one of two things is the case. We know they don't have infinite VC dimensions, so they're not doing like a full structural risk minimization where you give up having bounds on the data. So they've got a finite VC dimension, but that VC dimension must effectively be much smaller if in fact they're strongly biased toward, it sounds like they're doing risk minimization inside of a bounded VC hypothesis search, which I guess is what Vapnik says we should be doing anyway, right? So what's
slightly different than that. I got to jump to dinner for my.
Oh, I'm sorry. So
no, sorry, it's my sorry, because this is an interesting discussion. I've just written a 75-page paper on bounds, and I'm still going to get my head around it. So
sure.
Like,
well, you know what? I'll dig up your paper, and then if you want to talk again sometime, let me know.
It'd be fun to talk to you. I'm just interested in that kind of in this whole literature. I think it's a fascinating. I kind of got into it because of the bounds, basically. And so,
well, if you want to get a sense for what that formal learning theory business is about, that SEP article that I had them linked to, you'll read that in like 10 minutes. But Oliver Schulte he's really great. In fact, his dissertation was on doing this for a problem in particle physics, but that won't be in this little encyclopedia article. But you can read that in 10 minutes and get a sense for the gist of it, and then I'm happy to connect you with some folks at the cutting edge if you'd like.
Super, good, thanks. Really lovely talking to you. I really enjoyed this. I'm sorry.
Yeah, me too.
I always like to chat with you some other time. It'd be fun.
Well, that'd be great. Don't be shy.
Right. Cheers.
Take care, Art.